We all have challenges in life: sadness, broken relationships, anger, bullying, grief, and isolation. But there is hope. Together, we can learn how to bring back joy, re engage with life, restore relationships, and to be alone without being lonely. Welcome to Psychology Talks.
Thank you for joining us back for part 2 of how to help your kiddo with a trauma experience, or how to help them recover from a trauma experience, with Dr. Rob Lusk. He is the clinical director for the Baby Fold. He is also an adjunct faculty member at Illinois Wesleyan University, and he is a longtime specialist and expert in trauma treatment. So we are very glad to welcome you back to finish talking about this really important topic.
Well, thank you for having me.
So when we left off, we had been talking about some techniques that parents, teachers, other people can do to help with coping with some of those symptoms of trauma that they might see in their child or the child that they're supervising. So can we talk a little bit about what some of those techniques are and how people utilize them?
Absolutely, yes. In general, with kids, you want to typically use pretty active sensory kinds of coping skills that involve the senses, and I'll talk more about examples that involve movement. For adults, obviously, and for kids to an extent, what we hopefully will get to ultimately is the ability to stay calm by using in-the-head techniques. You know, when as adults, if we're in a situation where we're in a crisis, say, we obviously don't want to have to say, give me 30 seconds to practice my yoga or something. Like, we want to sort of do it all in our heads.
Mm-hmm.
Easier said than done.
Right.
For kids, those what are often called cognitive techniques or self-talk techniques may work, but the problem is it's even harder for kids in general than adults to stay calm enough to use those things when they're getting triggered. And biologically, when kids as well as adults are triggered, the thinking part of the brain, the frontal lobes or prefrontal cortex as it's sometimes called, actually starts to kind of shut down as they start to go more and more into fight or flight typically. And so it gets even harder when you're triggered to be able to use those coping skills. So you may have learned, okay, take deep breaths, count to 10 or something, stuff like that. But then in the moment when you're triggered, what do I do? What do I do? And it often is really hard to think of those things. And so you often need to have an adult present to help the kid co-regulate, as we call it. In general, we want the kid to end up being a self-regulator. Obviously, that's the ultimate goal, but realistically, the younger they are, the more likely, at least for a while, they'll need an adult to help them recognize when they're upset and when they need to calm. And so that's one thing that's kind of different from adults. It obviously helps an adult to have someone else cue them, but in most situations, we're kind of expecting adults to do it on their own. But this is where teachers, parents, other caregivers who understand what to do in these situations can really make or break the success of the situation. Because when the kid is triggered, our initial, especially if they act out, when somebody's triggered, so say they have an upsetting thought or something happens on the outside, like we see a lot of students in our schools triggered when they have to do something that they're frustrated by. So during math, there's a hard math problem, and then this is frustrating, and then that reminds them of something else, and then suddenly they take it from a tough math problem to I hate math, and they throw their book or something like that. The first thing, and this is so hard to do, is for the adult to basically stay calm and take a self-inventory in that situation. When a kid is triggered, it is so easy to fight fire with fire, if you will. They raise their voice, you raise your voice. They say something like, I hate math, and then you say, well, you have to do your math. You're kind of matching them. And when anyone, child or adult, is going into hyperarousal like that, the last thing that's helpful in a situation is typically to put more pressure on them, to put more demands on them, to get tougher with them. Because almost all of us feel very threatened in those situations. And so when an adult who's very well-meaning is trying to get them to calm down, those things often come across as even more threatening.
Okay.
So what we really want adults to try to do, whether it's a teacher or a parent, is first thing when a kid is triggered, even if they've just done something, as long as it isn't super dangerous. Obviously, if you need to maintain safety, that takes priority. But short of that, you connect with the kid first. Even though, if a kid throws a math book and says, "I hate you," it's real hard to have your first thought be, how do I connect with them or demonstrate empathy? But that really is the most effective way of getting someone who is escalating to at least stop the process from. So in general, I think what you want to do is just connect first. You want to try to put aside the fact that you may feel upset by what the kid just did, etc., and make an empathic statement. Something like, "It looks like you're really upset," can be enough, often followed up by, "What can we do to help?" or "Is there something I can do to help?" So the idea is they have just done, they're triggered, they're upset, and usually what they're expecting is for an adult to kind of come in and get tougher with them.
Mm-hmm.
And so the fact that you are trying to understand generally, in a sense, takes them off their guard and helps them calm down, or at least pause for a second, and often will respond. And then you can often offer those sensory active sorts of coping techniques. One thing that we find very, very helpful, the younger the kid, the more helpful in general, is what's called a coping kit. There are other terms for it, sensory toolkit, for example. But the idea is to have props ready that you can immediately, so in a little Tupperware container, a bag, something like that, but ready in your home, in the classroom, so that you can immediately offer the youth something concrete that serves as a distractor and something that engages their senses. And so what might you have in a comfort kit? Well, if you think about vision, a picture or something that they really like to look at, that can be very calming. If you think about touch, in general, things that give you a fair amount of feedback, sensory feedback, can be grounding. And so for some kids, for example, a feather is grounding, even though for others it wouldn't be because it's tickling. For some, using putty, doing something with their hands, ripping paper, there might be fidgets or other kinds of toys in there that can serve as distractors and something to play with and kind of put your energy into. So those are just a couple of examples of kind of the touch things. When it comes to taste, we often have things like atomic fireballs or candy that really, the very spicy candy, mints, for example, that are very, very strong, because those things are grounding. When people put those in their mouths, and again, kids or adults, it will often ground them. And we've had kids chew one atomic fireball after another, whereas like for someone like me, I can keep it in my mouth for 10 seconds. That's about enough. When it comes to sound, we often have, and we try to use the cheapest MP3 type players you can get, because kids will break them sometimes in these situations. But music is very, very grounding. And so if the youth has preferred music that's acceptable, at least to the parent or teacher, whatever, letting them listen to music can be a great calming kind of a thing. So, in a sense, and then smell, I guess the other one, we will often use scented sticks, or sometimes if you take scented oils and dip a cotton ball in the scented oil and then put it in a freezer baggie, or really, a good container so it doesn't lose the smell, you can have one of those in a coping kit. And then even if the youth gets upset, they don't, you can mess with scented oils and they can get smelly and, all over the place. But if it's on a cotton ball, very, very safe to do. So those are just some ideas of the kinds of things that you might want to do. If you don't have a sensory kit, or the youth doesn't want one, think about other kinds of movement. Breathing, for example, there is a ton of research across all age ranges that can be one of the best keys to relaxation. Taking slow, deep breaths, walking, any sort of aerobic type exercise can be very, very grounding. So those are the kinds of things that you, after you maybe connect and offer support, you want to try to engage the kid, typically in something that will calm them. And again, it's often got to be reasonably active.
So I heard breathing, I heard grounding, I heard sensory approaches, auditory approaches, and engaging really all your senses.
Absolutely. I think in general, the research says a multisensory approach is better than one sense as far as distraction and calming. So if you can engage multiple senses, that's great. And active movement can be, in general, better for more youth, but some adults as well, than something more passive, as I was saying earlier. So yeah, those are some of the best kinds of ways to help cope. And it doesn't have to be anything complicated. It's just partially distraction, partially engaging aspects of yourself that are not being triggered, in a sense. So you're kind of doing things, focusing on things that are not scary to you, making your body do things that are kind of incompatible with fear or anxiety. In general, it's so important for the adult in those situations, whether it's a parent or a teacher, to be grounded themselves. I know I mentioned that, but I think it's important to come back and emphasize that really the best predictor, in a sense, of whether you will be able to maintain calmness is whether you can stay calm yourself and whether you can stay in your prefrontal cortex, which means you're able to think as clearly as possible. That's not easy when a child is triggered and getting upset, especially if they're compromising safety, if they're threatening, if they're, getting up, moving around, destroying things, whatever. It's very, very hard for us to stay calm. So we often have to practice those techniques ourselves. But, that idea of the first thing you want to do in those situations is ask yourself, how am I doing? And if you are okay or okay enough, then you can proceed. If not, it's really important, unless there's an immediate safety issue that you have to attend to do whatever you can to get yourself calm. Because the approach that the adult takes when the traumatized child is triggered like that really will, again, be the biggest determinant of whether they recover without going all the way to an extreme meltdown, if you will, or not. And so initially, that connection idea, I'll elaborate a little bit on that, because some people feel like, well, that, it's giving kids a bad message. In other words, if, just to go back to the math book example, you're a teacher, one of your students says, I hate math, and throws their textbook on the floor. Okay, what I'm telling you is to open with empathy or connect with that student first. What a lot of people might think, what kind of message is that giving that student or the other students? What that student needs to hear, what the class needs to hear is, hey, pick up your math book, go to the principal's office type thing. Okay, I understand that perspective. And as a teacher, I suppose that might make things easy. The reality is, when a youth is triggered and halfway downstairs, as we like to call it sometimes, so they're not maybe in that full-blown hyperarousal, but they're not thinking rationally, then at that point, basically, the odds of them following a direction or a command are almost nil. So if the teacher says, okay, pick up your math book and go to the principal's office, there is probably a better than 50-50 chance in most situations with trauma survivors, who again have these trigger issues, that they will not say, oh, I'm sorry, okay, and then calm down, pick up the math book and sit down. They will escalate even more, often make an inflammatory statement, etc. And now you're dealing with a bigger crisis. Okay, before all it was a math book on the floor. Now I have a kid who is disrespecting me in front of the class and refusing to follow my direction. Now what do I do? Again, going down that path generally never leads to a good place.
Yeah, and so what I'm hearing in that connection piece is that you're establishing a level of trust with a child, that you're saying, by not escalating yourself, you're saying without saying it, that I'm a safe person for you to express your needs with, and I'm not going to judge you, or not even just judge, but I'm not going to punish you.
Yes.
For being human and having feelings.
Perfect way to view it. Yes. And it doesn't mean that we will not follow up with consequences once the situation is over. And that's the other thing. Often adults understandably kind of think, okay, well, we've got, how are you going to deal with this problem? If you are supportive to this kid, then they're just going to do it again, and the rest of the class will too, because you're reinforcing that behavior. When in fact, what you do is you problem solve after the youth is calm, because none of us can problem solve when we're upset. So assuming the youth is calm and we're calm, you can go through there are some structured problem solving models you can use, or you can just kind of talk to them about what happened, trying to get their perspective, sharing your perspective, and then figuring out, okay, what is a good way to deal with this situation and prevent it from happening again in the future?
Yeah.
So in this case,
and if there's more than one child in the home, or if this happened in a classroom, it seems like that would offer a nice opportunity to then talk as a group about, this is how we manage our issues. This is how we, so a really nice teaching moment, or a way to have a really nice discussion amongst the family or the class about how we regulate.
Absolutely.
when we're facing a challenge.
Absolutely. And then if there was some sort of damage done, if you will, that can't be immediately repaired by a discussion. So if a kid says something inappropriate, the discussion can repair that. But if they break something or hit someone or have stolen something, whatever, it doesn't mean, okay, there is no more follow-up. Basically, when everybody is calm, then you decide what a logical consequence would be. And this is where you want to wait till everybody's calm, because, again, you can't problem solve if either of you is still upset. So you're not going to come up with a good solution. And that might mean waiting a while, which is okay. Mm-hmm. And then the solution to the problem is hopefully logically related to the problem, which is called a logical consequence. So, for example, timeout is effective. There's tons of research on that, but timeout is not a logical consequence for very much, other than if you're disruptive socially, you should spend some time away from other people. That makes sense.
Right.
But if you hit your sister standing in a corner, it's not a logical consequence. The idea is you hurt someone, how can you make it up to her? Right. So concrete things are easier. Taking okay, you destroyed your math book. What's the best solution? Not stand in the corner for 5 minutes. Fix the math book, or buy us a new math book, or do enough work that you pay it off, kind of thing. That's, don't get mad, get even, I guess, is the idea. And if it's a logical tie, kids are far more likely to go along with it. Oh, that makes sense. Yes, I messed up the math book. I'm calm now. You're saying fix the math book, and then you're okay. So is there a need to then put them in detention for an hour? Probably not, because fixing the math book is what you needed to have happen. So the follow-up is different from kind of the standard way that we react to problems. But I think this is good, not just for parents and teachers of trauma survivors, but just about all kids. Mm-hmm. There's a fair amount of evidence that kind of approach really helps them learn better from their mistakes, in a sense, and then they don't resent you for kind of arbitrarily punishing them. They understand the logic of the consequence, and so they're much more likely to go along with it.
You talked before about grounding, and how that's one of the coping techniques that that parents or teachers or other people can kind of walk a child through. Can you give us some examples of how you could walk someone through a grounding exercise? You talked about using different sensory techniques or different sensory tools, but can you talk a little bit more about the practicalities of how you do a grounding exercise?
Sure. It's best to do it in private if that's possible, and I recognize it isn't in some settings. In other words, as people sometimes put it, isolation helps people calm. So in other words, if you're in a group and you're getting upset, it's just much easier to feed off of others or to feel embarrassed, etc. And so one thing that if any adult can do this is go to a private place with the child. It may not be possible, but if it is, that can often help, because then you don't have those distractors or other, I'm thinking in a classroom, for example, if one student's getting upset, other students may help, but they end up making it worse, or that student may just feel like they have to save face. Mm-hmm. So getting to a private place, if possible, as I've already talked about, making sure that you are calm, doing that self-check as an adult before you start grounding is critical, because if you're really upset, just as you've already talked about, you're not modeling it for them, you're not a calming presence, they're not going to be able to ground. So you want to be calm, you want to model that, and then you generally want to, this is something where I have to say it's critical, if at all possible, to practice before the actual situation when you need it. So this is one of those where it's like, the kid's being triggered, what do I do? Unfortunately, what I usually tell people is, okay, now we need to back up, or not back up, but now we got to do some groundwork before this is going to happen, because it's sort of like a fire drill. You want to learn it when there's no fire, obviously, so when there's a fire, you can just go on automatic pilot, kind of. Mm-hmm. You want to practice grounding techniques a lot with the youth when they're calm, mm-hmm. but that means they need to be motivated. And so ideally you identify things that work. And again, there are enough possibilities, because there's so many sensory activities and so many movement related activities, because almost anything aerobic, and I have, lists of all sorts of activities. I could certainly, talk about a number of them. But again, walking is one that is calming to most kids. And so the idea is, you get to another place, and then you have hopefully practiced this and worked on identifying already with the youth what kinds of techniques would be most calming, and then you offer them something. So if you have a coping kit handy, you may say, okay, let's take a look here. Which of these would you like to try? And if you've practiced with it, you may say, hey, in a situation like this, it seems like you really like the squish ball or something. Let's try that. So you can prompt even more. Or again, unless there's a safety issue, you want to keep it fairly light. Let's try breathing, or even if you have a relationship with the youth, you can often just start taking deep breaths and they will do it along with you. So sometimes if you say, let's breathe, they'll say no if they're upset, or something along those lines. But if you just start slow, deep inhale with your nose, slow, deep exhale with your mouth, a fair number of kids will just start matching that while you're doing it, which can really...
I was doing it while you were doing it, actually.
That's funny. So yeah, so modeling, doing it yourself, really, really helps. So when it comes to walking, for example, you don't say, I'll sit here while you walk in a circle around me. You walk with the kids. You're participating in the activity. Breathing, you do it with them, and it's more likely they'll do it in those situations. So usually if it's an adult that they have a decent relationship and it's something they practiced, you don't have to sell them on it too much. If necessary, there are times we put a simple reinforcement program in place to motivate kids to use it more, which is fine. Some parents or teachers may feel like, well, they should just do this without getting, some reinforcer. But the reinforcer can be social. You don't have to give them stuff. It can be fun time together, so that builds your relationship, and then it doesn't cost anything. And in general, if the adult is willing to get in there and really attune to the youth and show them, I care and I want you to calm down and I'm invested in your feeling better and I'll do this with you, usually they will participate. Not always. When they don't, which they won't always, afterward when you're all calm, then you do that same sort of problem-solving thing. You kind of do an autopsy in a way and say, all right, let's talk about what happened. It didn't work. We tried to stay calm and it didn't work. What can we do next time to maybe make it more likely that we'll calm down. And so then you try that the next time and adjust as needed. And sometimes that's a long process. But usually, if you're really working on practicing those techniques initially and then practicing them in the real stressful situations, especially when it's just a little stressful at first, because obviously when you're starting to use grounding coping mechanisms, you just want to have little triggers to practice with. You don't want somebody to get a huge stressor, or it's just not realistic that they'll be able to effectively use that technique to stay calm. And then you could kind of over time use more and more kind of stressful situations to practice with.
And we're running short on time, and we had some really good stuff that I wanted to get to. So I'm going to ask that our audience come back and please visit our YouTube channel and remember to subscribe and like.